So as mentioned, my name is Kirsten, and I am a recently ordained priest in the Anglican Diocese of British Columbia here on Vancouver Island. However, for the last few years, I have been a seminary student at AST, completing my supervised ministry placements, all of which happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as a result of this, my ministry training was like no one who had gone before me. It was truly unprecedented times, the likes that the clergy I was learning from had never experienced before. So as I came to this project, I was curious. How did Anglican clergy take the leap from the pews to virtual space? And what was this experience like? What did it teach us? This curiosity is the basis of my project because, well, we've just never done it that way before, and I wanted to know how it all worked out. But to begin with, it's important to ask the question, why does this matter and what is the context in the Anglican world? So we all know that in March 2020, the world was turned literally upside down. Overnight, clergy were faced with the question, well, now what? What do we do when the ways that we have always done things are no longer an option? As the pandemic took hold, it quickly became apparent that elements of Anglican worship would need to be assessed for a new context and style of worship. So in doing this, there are some elements to the Anglican tradition that would need to be flexible when moving into virtual space. So first off, Anglican worship is based in the common collective prayer of the people. Literally, our books are originally called the Book of Common Prayer. It's based in a call and response and a shared liturgy, which has been done in community for centuries. Second, Anglican worship is sometimes jokingly referred to as liturgical calisthenics, because throughout the service, it is embodied worship. We sit, we stand, we kneel, we move around for the peace, and we move to the altar and kneel again for communion, and so on. These embodied aspects of our worship were no longer an option online. And third, liturgy is incarnational. It is alive and living with the incarnate Christ and the indwelling of the Spirit that begs for our response and relationship with the divine, which happens in community. And finally, it's important to note that within the Anglican context, the Eucharist has been a central piece of worship for the last 50 years or so. And so Anglican Eucharistic theologies, they have the real presence of Christ in various ways. It's an intimate moment between Christ and the community. And there were questions around if this could be translated to online space and what that might look like. So these are just a few of the implications that clergy needed to quickly assess and decide on how to move forward during lockdown. So herein lies my question. When faced with something that no one expected, no one was prepared for, and no clergy in living history had ever faced, I couldn't help but wonder, how did Anglican clergy move their congregations into virtual spaces for worship? What steps did they take? How did they decide what format to use? And what influences were there as clergy responded to this drastic change? To tackle this question, I wanted to ask as many clergy as I could who had undergone this transition. I wanted to be able to ask questions and come up with some common theories around how this movement took place and how it turned out in the end. So a grounded theory approach made the most sense. I had 16 participants, all Anglican priests, agreed to participate, and I conducted 15 interviews, a few in person, many over Zoom, with one answering in the form of a questionnaire. These participants were all within the Anglican Church of Canada, but they spanned 4 different Canadian Anglican dioceses. These clergy also represented a diverse group of congregations. There were a mix of rural and urban people. There were communities that are Sunday attendance ranged from quite large of over 350 people on a Sunday to pretty small, around 30. The backgrounds of the congregations were diverse too. Some communities had a high concentration of professionals and academics, while others leaned more towards arts and culture. And some had high numbers of immigrants and international students. These parishes covered a wide swath of Anglican communities across the country. And with each Anglican priest, I asked the same set of 8 questions, all revolving around the movement of their worship into virtual space. Throughout this presentation, you may have noticed that I tend to use the term we when speaking of the Anglican experience, as I too am now an Anglican priest. But please be assured that the quotations shared are actually direct words from the participants that I interviewed. So speaking of direct quotes, throughout the interviews, clergy shared how they felt about going online and doing the work of worship during COVID. And there were a variety of responses. Some stated they were really excited, saying this was a time of real opportunity to do something different. Others absolutely dreaded the idea of using technology and struggled with things like preaching to a camera, knowing where your light source was. And one stated that this was the darkest hour of her life, as if the rug had been pulled out from underneath her, no longer being able to instinctively do the things she knew how to do. But a lot of them saw this as a creative time. One said, "I've never felt so creative in ministry," and shared that this was a chance to bring more people into the process of worship. During this process, all of the churches represented in this moved away from the Eucharist while online, and many shared missing this. One stated multiple times, "I really missed the spiritual nourishment of the Eucharist." And others really missed the in-person connection, stating things like, "It was so hard not seeing my people." And yet, among all the differences in the clergy responses and how they felt about pandemic worship, themes emerged that showed commonalities and how it all came together. So how did it work? I really was hoping to find some definite patterns, or perhaps a few clearly evident methods on how this all worked. Something that showed that there were specific steps that clergy followed to move into virtual spaces. But the reality is, moving from the pews to virtual space was a unique process, tailored to the needs of and by the skill sets within each congregation. For some, Zoom worked really well. The people responded because this met the need for being able to see faces of the people, of their friends from the pews. In other communities, the end result landed in a combination of live streaming and uploading a recording for people to watch later. And still others wanted to pre-record to ensure that quality was the highest possible for the people watching from home. The ways that clergy moved online were as varied and unique as the participants themselves, with no clear pattern to speak of. However, there were a number of shared insights amongst participants, which can shed some light into how Anglicans moved online and what was learned, even when the steps taken were very different. What I found really fascinating in the data is that regardless of where the congregation was, the years of experience of the clergy, or the demographic makeup of the congregation, the following 3 topics arose in all the responses as things that influenced the way in which online worship manifested in these communities. So first off, of prime concern for all of the priests was the safety of their people, be this working to adapt to changing COVID protocols, making decisions to move online instantly, or delaying coming back to in person, or looking for ways to meet at a distance outside. Safety was a huge factor in the ways that clergy adapted their worship. Because as one clergy aptly put it, that in this situation, keeping one another safe is the most Christ-like thing we could be doing. Another shared experience which shaped the way clergy went online was having someone in the congregation step forward who knew a little bit about technology, be it familiar with Zoom or maybe knowing how to upload to YouTube, knowing how to do a bit of video editing, or having some experience with cameras. 14 of the participants spoke of someone coming alongside to share some skills in this area. One clergy said, "I was in a panic, but then someone with the phone jumped in feet first to help film something, and we posted it to YouTube." He went on to share that the whole process was really based on trial and error, discerning what was going to work for him and his people. In fact, most of the clergy expressed taking around 6 to 8 months to really find a pattern and a process that was manageable and met the needs of the congregation. It was trial and error to figure out what could work with the space and the equipment and the skills available. The third common influence, which kind of surprised me, was how everyone spoke of the support of their diocese or their bishop being a key factor in the process. One simply stated, "I am so thankful for the direction of the bishop. I would have been absolutely lost without it." Within the 4 dioceses represented, all mentioned their diocesan leadership and spoke to the varying degrees of support, or in some cases, in some instances, lack thereof, from their bishop during the pandemic. The next set of shared experiences are those of surprises, things that brought new light to the experience of worship in online space, even if the method to get there was not alike at all. So first off, the data showed that all clergy who had multiple services on a Sunday condensed their worship to one single service. However, many also began offering forms of other kinds of worship, the daily offices, for example, and embraced these forms of church experience that the early church would have used, but in virtual space. One participant exclaimed that through the need to change during COVID, we rediscovered what it means to be church. And they expressed that COVID allowed us the space and the grace to reimagine what worship looks like, why we do it, and what it might mean for the people. And as showed time and time again, creative expression became the norm during this time. One participant shared that COVID gave us an opportunity to be creative in ways we never thought possible before. Through the interviews, examples of this shone through, from taking the gospel outdoors and recording the message by the ocean or up the mountain or at a public park, to inviting people to film at home and sending in clips, and discovering musical talents within the congregation that previously no one knew about. This was clearly a time for creative methods of ministry engagement. And I was surprised to hear that everyone I spoke with expressed their surprise at how a sense of community can be fostered online. We heard about this yesterday in Caitlin's presentation. Some even said that they established a whole extra congregation virtually. One priest shared with a laugh, "We actually gained members because we were online. I never would have expected that." The whole process of COVID brought many surprises, both good and bad, as I'm sure you can imagine, but it also led to many lessons that we learned along the way. And as part of the interviews, participants shared some of the things that they learned during this process of figuring out and discerning how online worship works and their time of hybrid ministry. Again, commonalities emerge that can help us to look forward. One thing that quickly became apparent during COVID was that people need to be connected. especially when isolation continued for so much longer than any of us originally imagined. One clergy shared that one of her biggest lessons was that our need for connection is stronger than any of us really imagined, even stronger than our need for sacrament. While the hunger for worship was strong, it was because of the connection that comes through our common worship that brings people together, providing an anchor in the midst of uncertainty, as opposed to participation in the Eucharist. And as shared previously, many clergy stated that their churches experienced growth in attendance through their virtual services. One shared, "Who knew online church could be a viable form of evangelism?" This priest shared that it seems easier to send someone a link somewhere in the world over inviting someone to come and sit next to you in the pew. And I would suggest that offering online worship is maybe a bit like the parable of the sower. It gives us a much broader space to scatter seeds, and we never know where it's going to land and take root. Therefore, it can aid in our call to make disciples and share the good news. And finally, without a doubt, the biggest lesson shared amongst the clergy participants is that despite their stated reputation of not being adaptable, and all clergy at one point saying some phrase of the phrase, "We've never done it that way before," during the interviews, they were surprised that somehow they came out of it the other side. As one participant stated, "Our capacity to not only embrace change, but thrive within it is bigger than anyone ever thought possible." So here we are, 3 years after the onset of the pandemic. We now find ourselves in an endemic world, and the question remains, how do we move forward? As much as I would like to be able to say that I have found all the answers and can give them to you now, sadly, that is not the case. The scope of this project simply did not lend itself to that sort of conclusion. However, here are some things to consider, to keep in mind as we move into a post-COVID world, 3 years after it all began. So first off, we need to recognize that COVID really caused us to stretch. And through conversations with the clergy, it appears that Anglican priests, and I imagine most clergy in other denominations, were stretched in ways that no one could have anticipated prior to March 2020. And while some communities are ready to throw out the mask and get rid of recordings, many churches are still cautious, and they're easing back into worship, including things like offering bread as a complete sacrament, withholding the common cup to reduce risk. But despite these places of caution, there's a strong yearning to go back to what was and forget all that was learned. One clergy used this analogy to explain this, saying, "It's a bit like we're an elastic band, and now that it's been let go, it wants to snap back to its original comfortable shape." Churches and clergy were stretched a little further and a little further each week as COVID morphed and changed, and protocols changed, and worship adapted. But as the restrictions began to lift, that elastic has been let go, and now is much closer to its original shape and wanting to go back to its old familiar ways. But the reality is, the die has been cast, and the truth is known that change truly is possible. Time and time again in the research, it was shown that flexibility and embracing new things is well within the capacity of us as people of God. And one clergy stated, "I had no idea what I was doing in the first few months. But looking back, we know we can adapt if only we remember to let go and let God." This advice would probably serve us well as we continue to live into that capacity for change and adaptability as we move into endemic space. So where do we go from here? Speaking again from the Anglican perspective, The pandemic thrust the Anglican world of worship into drastic change, the likes which we could never have imagined or anticipated. Communities which had previously shunned the idea of screens in the church, who felt the Eucharist was the only way to be spiritually fed, and people who are quite tied to our books of common prayer, embraced a world of worship with screens and technology and more ancient practices like that of the daily offices. And they proved their ability to adapt creatively for a modern world. And while I do not at all claim to have all the answers, I would propose that if the move from the pews to virtual space taught us anything, it is this. The way forward is going to be unique to each diocese and each congregation, as they continue to look at the needs of their communities of faith and their outside communities, and the spaces they have and the things they can offer that meet the needs of the people. We are the body of Christ, just as Laura was talking about in the previous presentation, with many parts that all need to work together, as it says in Romans 12. We need to continue to trust in the gifts that already exist and are thriving in our communities of faith, and allow those gifts to emerge, to flourish, and to shape the worship we offer, be it in person or online, as together we are the body of Christ. And finally, as much as many people yearn for the church to go back to what was, this really is only the beginning for an ancient church that is continually needing to adapt, to pivot, to creatively explore and respond to the changing needs of the world today. And the good news is that if we let God guide, creative adaptation is entirely possible. Because even in those moments when the rug has been pulled out from under us, God is there, offering guidance every step of the way.